Tonight, we're broadcasting live from Peacock Alley, and tonight at Peacock Alley, it's BAM Mondays, which is $1 off for their BAM mugs, which I guess we don't talk what that stands for, but it's a big mug.
Well, we talk about what it stands for, just not all of it.
Okay, so big mug.
It means big mug, and the A stands for something, and we'll let everyone fill that in.
Okay, so until 11 o'clock tonight, if you're out and about around town, you can stop down for $1 off on the BAM mug or $1 off on burgers. And by the way, I had a mushroom and Swiss burger. It was a great burger, great fresh buns. I bet they bake them back in the kitchen. So if you're out and about, I'd encourage you to stop on down to Peacock Alley, where we're broadcasting live this evening. And KFYR 550 AM, which you're probably listening to, or you'll be listening to on 1090 KTGO or 1100 The Flag in Fargo. So, Dale, you had a busy day, and you're fighting a cold and sore throat and all the things that come with this flu season. You're looking better than you sounded this morning.
Well, I don't look good anyway, even in the peak of health. As far as fighting a cold, I mean, the cold is winning rather decisively.
Did you have a busy day today, though?
So
yes,
what are some? Give us
a couple, 3-4 minutes before we get to our guest this evening. I know you got a busy night ahead of us, but what happened today in the Capitol?
Well, since we're in the bar, let's start with bars opening on Sunday and earlier than they normally do. Right now, if you're a bar in North Dakota, you can open at noon, with the rest of the businesses according to our Sunday closing law. Well, there's legislation in. It was heard by the House Industry, Business, and Labor Committee this afternoon to allow the bars to open at 10 a.m. on Sunday, just in time for the start, I imagine, of all the football pregame shows. And I'm sure that if this was in effect right now, the barkeepers that cater to the Super Bowl crowd would be quite enthusiastic about it, because they could sell another 2 hours worth of libations.
Cheers. And
there was a bill in House Judiciary. It's somewhat obscure, but I think it's an important subject. It says would be a special election required to fill a vacancy in the legislature unless the vacancy occurred during the legislative session. There's been a number of instances in recent years where legislators have resigned or become incapacitated. Mostly it's resigned, and they have someone appointed to take their place, and that person will serve during the legislative session without being elected. And that rubs some people the wrong way. I mean, this happened. This got started back in 1997 when the Speaker of the House at the time, his name is Clarence Martin. I don't think he was the Speaker then, but he was Clarence Martin was his name, and he died during the session. And he was a very well-liked man, and everyone took that occasion to say, okay, when you have a vacancy in the legislature during the session, what can you do to make sure that the district doesn't go unrepresented for the rest of the session? So some legislation was hashed out to have an appointment process, and that's what's done right now. And there's frankly some disquiet about the idea of a legislator serving who has not been elected unless it's extremely rare circumstances, such as a death during the session, which is what happened in Clarence Martin's case. And there's a bill in to change how that is done. There's been a number of property tax bills today, tax bills generally, that we're going to be talking about some of those this evening. One of them would reduce the sales tax rate from 4%, from 5% to 4%. That's being introduced by Representative Rick Becker. He's a Republican from Bismarck. There's also a bill introduced by a new senator from Fargo, George Sinner, the son of the former governor, and it would exempt clothing from North Dakota sales tax. In fact, one of our guests this evening, Representative Wes Belter, the chairman of the House Finance and Tax Committee, he introduced an identical bill recently, and it did not succeed. And this was in a previous session, of course. What really brought people into the Capitol today was a bill that says all school districts must include a high school. This is kind of a hardy perennial that grows up in every session. The logic of it is that if you have a school district, that you should support a high school with your property taxes. There are a number of districts in North Dakota that just support kindergarten through 8th grade or kindergarten through 6th grade, and then they tuition their students out to another high school, to a high school. And there's a feeling primarily amongst urban legislators that this is not a fair arrangement, that these kinds of districts don't pay their fair share of supporting a high school. Now, there's quite a big argument about that. But anyway, there's this bill every other year, I should say, that says you shall have a high school in your school district, or else your district will have to merge with another district, or it'll have to dissolve. And this brings in folks that like their elementary and middle school districts, and they look at this as kind of a toothache that won't go away. I mean, every 2 years that this bill gets introduced and it gets defeated, and then it comes back, and it's just a big pain for everyone.
Is this a rural versus city issue more so, Dale? That's what you're saying?
Yeah, it's primarily, yes. And, I mean, there are some situations where it's, most of these, in fact, I think all of these districts, these smaller K through 8 districts, they could be fairly described as rural districts, and they're typically just outside a city, and they, like Williston has one, and Bismarck has one. There's several of them. There's dozens of them. Maybe not dozens, but there's more than a few. And anyway, this bill brings in the folks that are supporters of these districts and basically say, we provide a good education for our kids, and we don't think that we're shortchanging anyone in terms of supporting a high school. And why is it that you people are always on our backs wanting to get rid of our school districts?
I see.
And it's a very interesting debate.
Now, there was maybe in the next half hour we could talk about that press conference that was today, because we'll have a little bit of time. But if you want to go ahead and take away these guests and talk about your...
We wanted to speak to a couple of gentlemen this evening who are experts on the subject of property taxation, or taxation generally, and property taxation in particular. We have Representative Wes Belter. He's a chairman of the House Finance and Taxation Committee. He's a former majority leader a Republican majority leader in the North Dakota House. He served in the 2001 session as majority leader just after John Dorso left the House. And he's been, when he was a majority leader, as far as I can remember, he's been the chairman of Finance and Tax, so he's quite familiar with the subjects that we're going to be discussing this evening. Also, we have Senator Jim Dotzenrod. He's a Democrat from D-Wyndmere. Senator Dotzenrod is on the Senate Finance and Tax Committee. And back in the days, and these days did exist for folks that might be doubtful about this, there was a time, believe it, and it wasn't that recently because I'm not like 100 years old or anything, but there was a time in the 80s and 90s that the Democratic Party had control of the Senate and the governorship, and things were politically quite a bit different than they are now. And at this time, Senator Dotzenrod was the chairman of the Senate Finance and Tax Committee, and also the chairman of the Political Subdivisions Committee. Okay. And so we have two gentlemen here who are very well qualified to talk about property taxes and taxes of all kinds. And what I wanted to start with was Senator Dotzenrod has a bill that essentially would forgive, I think it's the first $4,500 of taxable valuation from property tax. What this would have the effect of doing is it would exempt a large portion of the property value of a home from property tax, and the state would make up the difference to local governments. And this it carries a fairly significant price tag, actually. And we'll get into that in a moment. But Senator Dotzenrod, please describe what your bill's intended to do and what the strategy is here.
Well, the bill has 3 sections, and the first section applies to residential property and provides a reduction of it's $100,000 of value off the first $100,000 of value of that home. There's a provision in there that says the most that any one taxpayer can get is 80% of that, because the feeling is that there should always be some residual tax on a home of some kind, even though it may be small. There should be some. So we leave that 20% of the first 100,000 on there, and that is the reason is we feel that there should be some connection between the local boards, the school boards, the city council, the park board, whatever taxing districts are affected by the taxes on that house. And this is this bill that came out of the interim committee, and mine does not. Mine is a separate bill, but the one that came out of the interim committee did that. It did retain that residual value, and there's a concern that if we get too many homes that have zero tax, that there's going to be a lack of interest on the part of the homeowners about what the spending levels are set by the city council or the local taxing district board. So that's kept on there, and that does reduce the fiscal effect of the bill, because you can't get that full 100,000. You can only get up to a maximum of 80% of that, or $80,000. The second part of the bill applies that same dollar amount to the farmland that would be farmed and owned and taxes due on, that is farmed by a farmer living in a resident that is not subject to property tax. So and then the third part of it is a renter's income tax credit that allows them a certain amount of credit off their income tax based on 15% of their monthly rent, with a cap, an annual maximum of $900 in credit, which would be $75 a month. So those are the three parts of the bill, and the theory and the idea behind the bill is to try to find some way to get property tax relief spread out over a large, wide group of people that represent families that live here, that are residents here. The current buy-down we have on the mill levies does, a certain share of that does go to out-of-state interests. So that's where this bill came from.
Representative Belter, could you talk about the various approaches that the legislature is taking to property tax reduction? I mean, there's school mill levy buy-downs. There's the approach that Senator Dotzenrod just described, which is basically an expanded homestead tax credit. There's giving more money to local governments through the state aid distribution fund. There's a number of approaches. Could you just talk about those and what you think might be the most practical?
Yes, thank you, Dale. As far as the property tax goes, I think over on the House side, and what I personally really would support is that we do something very similar to what we do now, and that all property is treated equally. So whether it's a homestead, farmland, or commercial property, that they would all get equal tax relief on their property tax. But there are various versions of property tax relief, like Senator Dotzenrod's bills and others. There are bills dealing with the state aid distribution, which would give more money back to the cities and counties. I think that the cities and counties right at the present time are fairly satisfied with the way the current state aid distribution works, and I don't think there's going to be a lot of support to change that. I think where there will be changes is that we need certainly to get more aid out to the western infrastructure needs, as well as infrastructure needs in the eastern part of the state. And so with the surpluses that we have, and maybe with some changes in the formula on our oil taxes, we're hopeful to resolve many of the problems that the West is currently facing.
One of the approaches that was advanced, and this has not been popular, has been to extend property tax breaks only to residential property and not to commercial and agricultural property. Could you two gentlemen both talk about what you think about that approach?
Well, I'm what concerns me there is that this would certainly make a tremendous shift in who's paying the taxes then. Because if you take like a city of R-Fargo or something, if you just give residential, it may not make much of a difference. But if you go into the more rural areas of North Dakota, and if you start giving a $75,000 or $125,000 reduction off their property tax valuations, pretty soon you have a group of taxable property that isn't contributing anything, and then it leaves the rest of the tax to be paid by agriculture or commercial. And so I think that's the thing we want to guard against. We want to make sure that our tax is fair to all property tax payers.
Senator Dotzenrod, what do you think about the proposition of targeting residential only?
Well, when we had the hearing today on this bill, there was some testimony against the bill, and the primary reason that was given is that the income tax or the property tax relief in this bill is not proportional to the amount of property tax that's paid. And I think those interests that came in and said that, I thought they made a good point. And that is a weakness. I think it's a shortcoming that we do have in the bill, that it isn't proportional. What it does do is it tends to focus the tax relief onto those taxpayers that do not have as much. It targets it to the lower income end of the property tax stream, is what I would say. So after hearing what we heard today in the hearing, it is my thought that if we look at what our current mill levy buy down is projected to cost over the next 2 years, $402 million, and if we can find a way to do that and combine it with a homestead credit that's not as generous as we have in some of the interim committee bill was $75,000. The bill that I introduced today is 80% of $100,000. That there may be a way, and we need to get a lot of ideas out on the table, because there's a lot of different ways to deal with, and there's many other ideas we haven't even discussed here today about how to deal with lowering taxes on property. But there's conceivable that you could take some of the elements in this bill and reduce them down and provide this homestead credit, and still do the mill levy buy down, which spreads that benefit out to all the property in the state. One of the disadvantages, one of the criticisms that we've heard since we started this is that on commercial property there's about 35, 36, 37% of that property that the owners don't live in North Dakota. So we are providing a pretty good number of millions of dollars of tax relief to people that don't live here. And actually, when we first did property tax relief in the 2007 through 9 biennium, that was the concern at that time, is we provided it as a credit on income tax because we specifically were concerned about how many tens of millions of dollars we could be spending on tax relief for people that don't live here. We solved that. We solved that problem in that first year we did it, but we found a lot of mechanical problems in getting it work, to try to get the counties to make it work, and we just people didn't sense they were getting the relief on their property because it was a credit on their income tax. So we went to this mill levy buy down, which has actually been pretty popular. People seem to like it. It's simple. So I do think that there's a good reason to want to continue to keep that and augment it with some other ways of dealing with taxes on property for the people that we know are struggling with the bills, and they're on the lower end of the income stream, which this 2290 does.
Dale, one of the things I think we need to keep in mind when you talk about giving tax relief to out-of-state interests is you do run into a problem with, for instance, if you take farmland, there's farmland that's owned by out-of-state interests. And so consequently, if you're giving tax relief to an in-state, but you're renting land from an out-of-state, you got your out-of-state landlord that's not going to be happy, and or you may rent a building that's owned by an out-of-state interest. They're not getting a tax break, and the person that you're competing with across the street is getting the tax break because it's owned by in-state. The other thing I think is very important is that we certainly try to get more relief to low-income elderly people with the homestead credit. Each session we've improved that, and I think this session there'll be moves to to help those people even more, and I think that's an important aspect that we need to keep in mind at the legislature.
Do you think the governor's proposal is adequate along those lines? The governor's proposal to improve the homestead tax credit?
I haven't really reviewed the governor's tax proposal yet, and so I just really wouldn't want to comment on where I would come down on that very issue, but I do believe that we need to provide more relief in that area.
We did have a hearing in the Senate side on that bill, the governor's bill, and I think there's a lot of support for it. He raises the brackets up, and then he discounts Social Security income, so it does get to be, there may be some concern that we've gotten it. It appears to me there'll be a lot of legislators that'll qualify for homestead credit. We've gotten the brackets quite high. And the thing is, it's limited only to homes of value of $100,000 or less. So it might work. There are some people that are looking on the committee at looking at those home values in the bill. But I think that generally, if you look at the expanded brackets offered by the governor in his budget, I think there's quite a bit of support to do that.
We've been speaking this evening to Senator Jim Dotzenrod, a Democrat from Wyndmere. He's a member of the Senate Finance and Tax Committee and a former chairman of the Senate Finance and Tax Committee. And we've also been speaking this evening to Representative Wes Pelter, the chairman of the House Finance and Taxation Committee and a former House Republican Majority Leader. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time.
Thank you.
No, you bet. Thanks.
This is Gary Emineth and Dale Wetzel broadcasting live from Peacock Alley, the legislature today. We come back from the break. We're going to begin talking about the oil tax and breaks that we're looking at coming out of the press conference came today from the Republican leadership. Thanks for listening. Welcome back to Peacock Alley. Gary Emineth here with your host, Dale Wetzel. We're in the legislature today talking about a lot of things that happened at the legislature today. And Dale, today was a press conference by Republican leaderships and dealing with oil tax. And I think that's the segment that you're going to be addressing some of those subject matters this evening. So I'm going to turn it over to you and let you take it away. These are important matters to the state and big funding.
Yes, we have with us Senator Dwight Cook, who's the chairman of the Senate Finance and Taxation Committee, and he's also the primary sponsor of the bill that you just mentioned to restructure the North Dakota oil tax and eventually lower the top tax rate from 11.5% to 9.5%. We also have Senator Connie Triplett. She is a Democrat from Grand Forks. She's a member of the Senate Finance and Tax Committee, which will be reviewing this measure. Just to give the most basic summary of it, it restructures North Dakota's oil tax and lowers the top rate beginning in January of 2017 from 11.5% to 9.5%. One of the things I want to do right now is read a statement that was put out by the Democratic leadership in the North Dakota legislature. We're talking about Representative Kenton Onstead of Parshall and Senator Max Schneider of Grand Forks. They released this statement. I'm going to read it. It's short. It says, "This is a proposal that cries out for close scrutiny. We will continue to insist that oil companies pay their fair share to address the challenges that have arisen in western North Dakota due to the rapid development of our natural resources. Beyond that, we must recognize that the extraction of oil is a one-time harvest that must be made to benefit future generations. Those priorities, addressing our challenges and making permanent investments in our people that will outlast the boom, must be our focus this session. If there comes a time when we need to re-examine our tax structure to keep North Dakota's oil industry competitive, we will do so. For now, we should be fixing rutted roads and preserving our quality of life, not cutting taxes for the oil companies." Senator Cook, I'm sure that that is going to be frankly, a principal criticism of this bill, in that oil, it proposes eventually to reduce the tax rate for oil production in North Dakota at a time when oil production is booming under the present tax structure. And could you just discuss why you think that this is necessary?
Well, first off, Dale, thank you for having me here tonight. And I think, considering the statement that you just made, they should really like this piece of legislation. The bill does some things immediately, and then, of course, it does some other things in 2017. There'll be almost 2.5 sessions that can happen before 2017. We're all concerned about the oil industry. We've become pretty well addicted to this revenue, but we got to understand just how volatile this industry is. There's a lot of things that can certainly affect this industry, affect the revenue stream in the North Dakota, and so many of these things that can have a tremendous effect on it, we're not in control of. So it's a volatile industry. It's a tough time to make decisions. So the bill's doing some things immediately, July 1st, 2013. We're fixing the property, stripper well property exemption. That's going to cost, that'll be an $83 million tax increase on the oil industry. I don't think the right time, or now is the right time to increase taxes on the oil industry. So we've put some other things in the bill to try to minimize the effect of that tax increase, and we got another stripper well, or another exemption available for wells outside of the Bakken and the Three Forks. We've changed the definition of stripper wells from 30 barrels for the deepest wells to 45, the threshold. And so it's going to end up being a $28 million tax increase this biennium. And then in 2017, of course, the tax rate goes down. But what the oil industry is giving up, and what we all have to understand, is all of these other incentives that we have out here that are tied to a trigger price. I think that price right now is about $53.20. And, you know, who can predict what this industry is going to be like in 2017? Who can predict what the price of oil is going to be like? But if these triggers kick in, if that oil goes down to that price again, that could cost the state $2.1 billion. So they're giving up a lot. I don't look at this as a tax decrease. We're trying to just bring some stability and predictability to the oil industry so we can all make some wise decisions.
Senator Triplett, what do you think of that analysis?
Well, you know, I start from the place where I start on a lot of bills in the Tax and in the Finance and Tax Committee, which is that our legislature has a flawed system of analyzing the fiscal cost of bills. As you know, that Legislative Council is required to provide us a fiscal note on each bill that has some fiscal impact. And so I think that what Senator Cook has described for you is an accurate reflection of the fiscal impact of the current bill for the upcoming biennium. But by putting off the tax reduction to 2017, we don't even ask our fiscal analysts in Legislative Council to tell us what the real costs will be over time. And I think just a very conservative analysis would suggest that we are looking at giving up billions and billions and billions of dollars over the next 40 years by this reduction. So granted, Senator Cook is correct that the oil industry is giving up something by giving up the exemptions that are in place for them should oil prices drop again. But they are asking, or Senator Cook is asking, the people of North Dakota to give up billions of dollars in revenue over the next generation.
Senator Cook, could you describe the significance of, first of all, could you tell us what a stripper well is and how the state's taxation of stripper wells, in your opinion, needs to be changed?
Stripper wells are wells that become low-producing wells. The deepest wells in the state, they hit a threshold of 30 barrels per day. Once their production drops down to 30 barrels per day, they get classified as a stripper well. And that's its incentive. What happens then is that the extraction tax goes away. So if you drive across the state, every well you see pumping out there is paying the 5% production tax, but the wells that are below 30 barrels per day, that's all they're paying. They're not also paying the 6.5% extraction tax. We create that incentive to encourage the oil industry to go in there and work over those wells and hopefully bring that production back up again. The well is already there. We should get all the oil we can out of it. The stripper well property is a property in which a well has been drilled in, and that well goes below that threshold of 30 barrels a day, and then that property becomes a stripper well property, and all new wells that are drilled in there are also don't have to pay the extraction tax, the 6.5% extraction tax. So what's really unique here is these Bakken wells, because of the way their production is, they drop real quick the first 2 years, and then they sort of stabilize out. But we're going to start having Bakken wells in these stripper properties that are going to be producing, probably 1,000 barrels a day that are going to qualify for stripper well status. That's the problem that we got to solve, and I think everybody knows we have to. It's a complicated program that we put in place that's out there, and we got to fix it. It's been there for a long time.
So if I understand you correctly, under the current law, some wells that are actually quite large producers are benefiting from a tax structure that was designed for wells that produce very little.
Very little. That stripper property was put in place back when we had the vertical wells. Didn't consider the horizontal wells that are coming in now, and they're going to start coming in. So that's what's the timing of this. We got to fix this session.
And so I imagine that the oil companies presently are quite enamored of the idea of having a favorable tax treatment of a well that's producing 1,000 barrels a day. Is that one of the difficulties of this legislation in terms of getting the industry to buy in? Is that they're giving up something like that?
Well, that's one of the difficulties. 141 legislators. If we're willing to do it, we can do it. But the oil industry is doing a lot for this state, and I certainly don't think anybody wants to advocate now for a tax increase on the oil industry.
Senator Triplett, you mentioned this earlier, but I guess the basic question that has to be answered for people in North Dakota is why is it that this is necessary to do? Because the industry is the production has been growing almost exponentially.
What is the it in your sentence before you get too far?
Sure.
Why is it necessary?
Why is it necessary to change the oil tax structure?
I don't think it is. I would be on the opposite side of Senator Cook's bill on
and
this.
I would want you to take.
Oh, okay. My position is that the oil companies came to North Dakota with the tax structure essentially as we have it now. We have made some very tiny tweaks in the tax structure to the benefit of oil companies since this new boom started in about 2007. But essentially, the oil industry came to North Dakota knowing what the terms were. And, I think of the 6.5% extraction tax, which was put on in the 1980s by a vote of the people and inserted into the Constitution of North Dakota by a majority vote of citizens. I think of it more as sort of the people's share of the oil production rather than a tax on the industry. And I really don't think that we as a legislature ought to be tampering further with the people's tax. The legislature before my time in this body really poked that 6.5% full of holes with a lot of exemptions in an effort to draw the industry back during a time when there wasn't much production going. But I don't see that there's any reason now to add to that to add to the destruction of that tax by reducing it further. The oil industry is not going anywhere, and I just don't see the need for this.
I've got a question for you related to the extraction tax. That's 6.5%. So because of the way they're doing the Bakken wells, so because they got one down and now because it might be going 90 degrees different direction, is there a certain size of where that stripper well is protected? In other words, is it like in 40 acres, 80 acres because of the direction they go out? And that's some for our listeners out there. Now, we may all kind of understand it, but to try to get a handle on 6.5%, that's a lot of money, obviously, that the oil companies aren't paying. But the development of the Bakken is going to be many wells on what these low-producing areas are, and that's the exemption you're specifically talking. Is that correct?
And the stripper well property, as Senator Cook accurately stated, was developed by the legislature as an incentive in the days of the vertical wells when there were a lot of dry holes, and it was an attempt to encourage the oil industry to come back to those areas and try again to find oil in what had been a dry hole. And so those were typically 40-acre spacings, as you mentioned. Now with the horizontal drilling, the spacings are typically 1280s, which is 2 full sections of land. Sometimes they're twice that and even 3 or 4 times that. And so whatever the unit is defined as, by the Oil and Gas Division and the Industrial Commission, that's the unit we're talking about. So if you drill one well in a 1280, for example, and then let it sit until it declines down to stripper well status. Then you come back in and drill 8 more wells, and they all come in at 1,000 barrels a day. They would all be stripper wells by the way the stripper well property is. So I think Senator Cook and I are in complete agreement that is an exemption that has to go. It was designed for the days of vertical drilling when finding the oil was not guaranteed by any means, and now we're drilling at virtually 100% as long as people stay inside the outer limits of the Bakken.
Senator Cook, related to the bill, are there additional provisions that these incentives that go in place in 2017, are there additional things that are important outside of this extraction tax of these stripper wells? What are some of the other additional parts of the measure? Besides, is it flat? To stay at 9.5%, is that kind of a permanent fixed number as opposed to the variable of the production of the price of oil in the market?
It'll stay at 9.5%, but there are 10 other incentives that are going away in 2017. And just the easiest way to explain these incentives is to show what it does in the real world. Senator Triplett talks about the taxpayers' money, but this is what I talk about when we want to bring stability. And the listeners can't see this, but I have a chart in front of me that shows what our effective tax rate has been for the last 12 years. I have it here. And it goes all over the place, but you can see that we have had many years where the effective tax rate was down around 7%. And then it started coming up as these incentives kicked out. And we've had a nice increase now for the last 3 or 4 years that is bringing it close to 11%. I mean, we may have a 11.5% total tax. That's the most tax that any well is going to pay, but some are paying 11.5%, some are only paying 5%, so we end up with an effective rate. This effective rate could go down to 7% again, real quick. It could go down real quick, and that's what it is that I am trying to stop from happening. I want to bring some predictability in here, just get a steady rate. I think if you average this out, you might find that we're below 9.5% over the last 12 years, and it's a complicated tax rate. We've done it to ourselves, and we ourselves now have got to fix it. We've introduced a bill today that I think is the place to start. Senator Triplett and I are both on the tax committee. I chair it. It's our responsibility to solve this issue. We're going to sit here and have a lot of discussions during the next few months. Ultimately, I believe, and Senator Triplett will agree, I think something's going to go to the governor because the stripper property fix has got to be taken place of. Senator
Triplett, I guess, do you think that the oil industry deserves any sort of trade-off, if that's the term, for giving up this lucrative stripper well exemption?
You know, I've thought about this for the last couple of years, and I've tried to find that kind of neutral place, and I quite frankly haven't been able to because there are so many variables that we don't know. But I'd like to respond to Senator Cook's concern. I would share those concerns to a larger degree if the people of North Dakota had not approved the legacy fund. You know, we did put that on the ballot a couple of years ago, proposing to set aside 70% of the oil production, and people voted that down. We came back 2 years later, put it on the ballot again at 30%, and the people supported it. So we are now putting away 30% of both taxes, both the gross production and the extraction tax, into a legacy fund that cannot be touched by the legislature at least until 2017, and after that only with some restrictions. So I like I said, I would worry a lot more about the possibility of the world price of oil dropping and the triggers going on if we didn't have that as a backdrop for ourselves. But we do have that as a backdrop, and so I'm not as concerned about it as I otherwise would be. And I think it would be a good thing to get rid of all of those exemptions so that everyone was on a level playing field, because I don't think we need them anymore now that we know that the Bakken is essentially like mining coal. You know, I mean, the oil is everywhere under the earth at that particular level in a defined area, and everyone knows what the defined area is. They may be having to work a little bit to figure out where the edges of it are, but once you get inside that oval of the Bakken, the oil is there. It will be there on every square mile, as Lynn Helms is fond of saying. There is oil there to be had, and so there is no risk to the oil companies anymore. And I just don't think that we really need those incentives. But I think what is being proposed here is is simply a gift to the oil industry and asking the people of North Dakota, as I said earlier, to give up many, many, many billions of dollars over the next couple of generations.
I'd like both of you to address the idea that, competition with other states that have shale rock formations. I mean, what are their tax rates? Is that an important factor in the argument over whether North Dakota should restructure its oil taxes?
Well, I think the oil industry, of course, is a very capital-intensive industry. It's a lot of investment. They're all going to look at where they can get the best return on that investment, and if they think that they can get it better somewhere else, that's where they're going to go. I think as far as our tax rates go, if you look at our tax rate on oil, I think you're going to say that we're probably on the high side. I think if you look at all the taxes that get imposed on the industry from state to state, I think we're the only state that doesn't impose a property tax, does not impose a property tax. So I think we ultimately end up probably in the middle of the pack out there. But it also costs a lot of money to bring that barrel of oil to the ground out here in North Dakota. We got winners. Texas does not. They're going to look at what it costs to bring a barrel of oil to the ground. And we do have competition. We invented shale, or drilling in the shale here. They're all using it now.
One of the things that both of you would be familiar with is that a bill similar to this, although certainly not identical, but it's similar to this, was brought up 2 years ago by the House Majority Leader, Al Carlson. Now, it had some graduated taxes depending on production, but it had some, I think it's fair to say it has some similar aspects to what Senator Cook's new legislation is. And at that time, that bill was not taken up. It was, and there were a number of factors I imagine that both of you could discuss. But what is so, if it wasn't a good idea 2 years ago, what makes it a good idea now?
You'll have to ask Senator Cook.
It's all about timing. 2 years ago when that bill came in, it was after crossover. It was amendments to a House bill that we had in the Senate. If we would have put it on, we would have never had a hearing on that bill. We'd have never been able to take input from the public. I think that's very important. This bill, now that it's introduced at the beginning, will get 4 hearings, one in the Senate tax, one in the Senate appropriations, and then the same thing in the House. The other thing is we didn't 2 years ago know the size of this oil industry. The rig count was still going up. Production was still going up. We now have answers to that. We've seen it level off. We've seen the rig count start to go down. We know where the Bakken is. We just had our first month of decreased oil production. So we know a lot more than we did 2 years, and a lot of times with legislation, finding a solution to a problem, timing is everything.
Senator Triplett, do you think that was it a matter of timing 2 years ago, or is it because it's a flawed idea?
No, I think Senator Cook is correct that the idea didn't really gel until after crossover, and so I think everybody was concerned that a major change like this should have proper hearings. So I think that was why there was reluctance on the part of everyone in the legislature to bring it up. I'd like to respond, if I could, to the notion about competition with other states. I think that was more of a concern, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when we had oil booms in the past, and there was really very little expertise inside the state of North Dakota in terms of knowing how to drill an oil well. In this go-round, we've got a fair number of homegrown oil men who have figured out how to drill the Bakken. And so even if the major companies who have assets in other states decide to pick up and leave, I think that the void would be filled by our local folks who have no assets, as they refer to them in the oil industry, in other states. And so I'm not as concerned about competition as I would have been if that hadn't happened. So I think we owe something to our local folks who have figured out how to play in this industry, and that will keep us going no matter what happens in other states. Now, obviously, as Senator Cook said, the world price of oil collapsing would obviously hit everyone. But if it's just a matter of the major companies deciding to take their rigs and go play somewhere else, I think we have people here who would continue the industry. You
raise a point that I wanted to raise with both of you. Our taxes and the state's tax structure really that important, and is it just frankly, a function of the oil price. I mean, as long as the state's taxes are not exorbitant, which I don't think that anyone would argue that North Dakota's taxes are exorbitant on the oil industry, isn't price everything. I mean, taxes almost don't matter. I mean, if the price of oil is $100 a barrel, if the tax is questionable, well, people will still be piling in, looking for their strike.
I would have to argue all you got to do to answer your question is look at Alaska. They drove them out of the state with taxes. So there is a point where taxes do matter. I think the question we can debate is what is the point?
All right.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that, Senator Triplett?
Oh, sure. I'm sure there's a point where you could drive people out, but I think we're a long, long way from that point in North Dakota.
We've been speaking this evening with Senator Connie Triplett from Grand Forks. She's a Democrat, and she's a member of the Finance and Taxation Committee in the North Dakota Senate, and we've been speaking to Senator Dwight Cook, a Republican from Mandan, who is the chairman of the Senate Finance and Taxation Committee. They're going to be taking up an oil legislation that we've been discussing, which is sponsored by Senator Cook, and it's going to be one of the major bills of the legislature.
Coming live from Peacock Alley, this is Gary Ameneth and your host, Dale Wetzel. Thanks for listening.